I found a dead Bigfoot in 1968. I buried it on my land. This is what happened next. Those words sit in my mouth like a stone I've been carrying for 50 years. I can still feel the weight of it when I stand at the edge of the north field at dusk, when the light goes thin and the cottonwoods throw long, patient shadows. You get to a certain age where the past sits heavy enough to press the bones inward. I don't tell visitors much anymore. Most folks around here have their own strange stories. They call me a farmer, a stubborn old man, maybe a little strange for keeping the same place when my hands won't do what they used to. But the truth is a different kind of stubbornness. It doesn't leave you alone. In 1968, I was 46, still strong enough to walk the ridge fence by lamplight and stubborn enough to think I could straighten any problem with a shovel. Ellen and I were married 12 years. We had a couple of kids, grown now, with their own children, and the house still holds their old toys in the attic like fossils. Back then, the night smelled different. Gasoline and cut hay, tobacco smoke from the diner on Route 9, and the particular musk that comes off the river during late summer. People didn't lock doors the way they do now. You'd leave a pickup running, come back from a run to town with a sack of seed corn, and the world would be the size of your yard. That night, the world stepped a little larger. I was checking fence lines. A storm had come through the week before, and a corner of the pasture had been trampled by something big. I walked the barbed wire by the old windbreak, my flashlight cutting a yellow lane through the dark. The moon hadn't come up yet, but there was enough sky to see the mist over the creek. I heard the sound before I saw the shape, a sort of heavy, breathy snuffle, like a hog, but not a hog, something that made the hairs on my forearms stand up. Then it stepped out from behind the cottonwoods. I'll be honest, I had never seen anything like it in my life. It was tall, taller than a man, bowed in the shoulders, bigger around than any steer I ever raised, covered in hair that was dark but not black. In the light of my flashlight, it had a sheen, like the hide of a bear in good health. It stood on its hind legs and looked at me. It had hands, long-fingered, and the face, well, you remember a face like a dream you can't quite recall. Broad, flattened nose, deep-set eyes that reflected my light. In the papers later, someone would call it humanoid. Back then, there wasn't a paper for it. There was only the sound of my heart running against my ribs. I did something I have spent a lifetime trying to forgive myself for. I had my 30-30 in the pickup because coyotes had been pushing lambs on the neighbor's place. I shot the thing. I don't justify it. I don't try to color it heroic. It was reflex. It was fear braised into instinct. It fell without a cry that I could understand.
There was no roar, no monstrous noise, just a sudden, terrible stillness. For a while I stood there in the mud with the flashlight in my hand, watching the steam rise from its fur in the cool night air. Its chest still moved once, then twice, then not at all. Up close it looked softer than you'd expect. Its face had, my God, features that troubled me, like the suggestion of a sadness. I thought of Ellen when I bent to feel for a pulse I knew I wouldn't find. I thought of the kids when I dragged my hand through the dirt and found blood under my nails. What do you do when the world gives you something that doesn't fit into any neat box? There were a dozen ways to act. I could have called the sheriff and told him I had shot a cow-sized animal. I could have taken it to the university, or left it on the road and let someone else deal with it. But a darker voice was in me, the voice that said cameras would come, that said men with clipboards and clever words would come, that said my family would be at the center of debates and cups of coffee in greasy diners all over the county. Scientists would take it, collectors would try to buy it. There would be reporters outside the house, kids at the date, strangers in the back 40 with boots in my wet pasture. I thought, foolishly and selfishly, that by burying it I would protect my life and theirs. I told myself I was sparing the creature too, sparing it a spectacle it did not deserve. I dug with my hands until the palms of them burned, then fetched the shovel from the truck. The ground was softer under the cottonwoods and there were roots to cut, but I worked until the morning smelled like coffee and the sky was lavender. I wrapped the body in an old canvas tarp from the barn, the kind we used to cover hay in winter, and I dug a hole big enough to take it without the shoulder scraping. I didn't want anything sticking out. I tamped the dirt down, covered it with fallen leaves, and pressed the ground with my heel until it looked like any other low spot in the field.
Ellen woke when I came in, boots wet, and the tarp under my arm. She asked where I'd been. I told her I'd been fixing a fence that the storm had taken. She tilted her head the way she always did when she thought I was safe, and she gave me that kind, worrying look that said she knew the difference between a man who worked hard and a man who carried a weight he shouldn't. I lied. I told her it was a cow. She believed me because that's what she does. She has never been a woman given to suspicion. Later, she told me she smelled something on my clothes, like metal, and she asked again. I said I must have cut myself on some rusted metal and that she'd worry herself sick if she kept digging. For the first year, I told a lie as a shield. It worked. We went on with corn and hay and the small rituals of marriage. I mended nets and put old feed out for the cat. We raised a boy to drive a tractor and a girl to like the way the riverbank smelled in spring.
People came and went. Life kept its steady ticking, like the old kitchen clock that never set itself by anything other than sunrise and supper. But secrets are like moonlight in the creek bed. They leave a trace no matter how careful you are. Every time I drove past the patch of ground where the shovel had sunk, I felt it, the pressure, the small private guilt that makes a man glad he has a fence and a barn and somewhere to hide in plain sight. The more I hid the body, the more my life became a series of half-steps around it. I changed the way I walked across the yard. I started leaving the porch light on some nights so Ellen wouldn't call for me. I woke up in the dark thinking the thing was there in the corner of the bedroom, and I would have to sit in the kitchen waiting for my heartbeat to quit trying to race. You learn to rationalize in small ways. At first I told myself I had done it to protect family. I told myself there was no law book for this kind of thing. There was only a law of the land and a law of survival. But those rationalizations thin out when you sleep alone and your hands shake as you reach for your fork. There were nights I walked to the cottonwoods and stood with my trench coat buttoned up against the cold and stared at the mound like it was another person who had left without saying goodbye. I talked to it sometimes, not aloud, never aloud, but in my head I offered apologies. Sometimes I imagined that if I could bury the shame deep enough, it might stop following me. People change around a secret. Ellen changed, not because of anything I ever did openly, but because I had become less present. Things that used to be easy, talking at the kitchen table, picking out curtains at the store, the tender little quarrels over nothing, stopped being easy. There's an intimacy to being ordinary, to scolding over burnt toast or arguing over the right way to mend a fence. I withheld that intimacy by withholding the truth. She noticed. She assumed different things. Doctor visits, a bad year with the cattle, a new ache in my back. None of it was wrong. None of it touched the central thing I had taken upon myself. But life cares little for a man's private verdicts. 10 years is a long time to carry a buried thing in your yard and expect the world to remain unmoved. While I kept my secret, the government and the universities went about their business. Quibbles over funding, late-night conferences, the slow march of scientific paper upon paper. Popular culture started to pick up on shadows in the woods and strangers with cameras. There were radio programs that talked about strange tracks and magazines that printed grainy photographs. People who liked the idea of mysteries started to fix their eyes on the world in a certain way. They listened for footfalls. It wasn't the cultural noise that brought the truth up for me. It was the bills and the crossing of paths with a man who took his job earnestly.
Dale Hutchinson was a livestock inspector for the county. He was the sort of man who tightened his hat and carried a clipboard and believed in record-keeping, the way some people believe in prayer. He was the sort of man who noticed things. I saw him most years when I needed paperwork filled out, vaccination records, tags for calves, a note about a stray dog. He had an honest face. Men like him made things go the way they were supposed to. We were the kind of neighbors who passed like ships, polite but not intimate. The morning he came to my gate in late March of 1978, the air was sharp and the frost still held in low places. I remember the exact way the light hit his notebook as he leaned against the fence rail, the way his boots left shallow prints in the frozen pasture. He had that professional look, the kind that says you are dealing with someone who loves his job enough to learn it well. "You been having trouble with your north pasture?" he asked before he even put his pen to paper. He was younger than me, mid-30s maybe, with close-cropped hair and eyes that managed to be kind and skeptical at once. "Storm damage last fall," I said, the answer rehearsed from years earlier. "Lost a corner of fence. Thought I'd let it settle this winter before making a proper repair." Dale nodded and made a few notes. We moved toward the cottonwoods,
because where else would an inspector look when he saw a patch of pasture that didn't match the rest? He paused and bent down. His gloved hand brushed a tuft of leaves and then the ground. He straightened slowly and looked at me without a smile. "This ground looks like it's been moved recently," he said. "Not just the storm. You see how it's settled? Not like nothing," he added, tapping the pad of his thumb on the soil. My heart rate doubled. All the old instincts, digging, hiding, came back with a cruelty of their own. I had checked that ground 1,000 times with a shovel. I had tamped it down with my boots and covered it with brush. I had been proud of how ordinary it looked. But the earth remembers. Over the years, animals press down, frost lifts, roots curl. A person with an eye and a clipboard notices. "I've been walking by there now and then," I said, trying to let my voice be the slow, careful thing it used to be. "Maybe some raccoon dug. Kinda late for 'em, but animals do what they do." Dale took his cap off and scratched the back of his head like a man thinking of the right word. "You know what I'd have to do?" he asked. "I gotta note it, run it by the county. If there's a carcass or something that's been handled improperly, I gotta report it." I could feel it closing around me like a rope. In my head, the conversation forked into a dozen paths. If he reports, the sheriff might come, then a coroner, then people with specimen boxes, men with clipboards. If he didn't report, the body would remain where it had lain for 10 years, and I would go on living with my lie a little longer.
The idea of telling the truth then felt like stepping into a hailstorm you couldn't come back from. "That's a long way from town," I said, because I had to say something. "A lot of paperwork for a little dirt." "Still gotta do it," he said quietly. "Duty calls, Jerry. I don't make the rules." He used my name, and the way he did, plain, used, pulled at me worse than any accusation. The field was a place of rules, too. Fence mended before lambing, calves tagged, the proper vaccines. This was a rule I had broken and then tried to forget. A man like Dale believed in the rulebook. I tried to bargain. It's an ugly thing to try and bargain with your conscience by bargaining with another man's duty. But I'm a farmer. Trade and delay are part of how we live. I told him the truth without telling the truth. I said my wife had been sick with a cold all week. I remarked on the new calf I wanted to brand before anyone else knew. I asked for time to tidy up the number of loose ends that come from having lived so long in one place. "Could you," I started, and my voice went gravelly, "give me 24 hours? Let me look at it myself before you write it up." Dale hesitated. He had a pen poised over a little box on his pad. He debated the line between empathy and obligation. "I'm not supposed to promise anything," he said finally, "but I'll come back tomorrow around noon. If there's nothing problematic, we'll go from there." That "we'll go from there" was the tightrope he'd thrown over me. It sounded like mercy and like a verdict at the same time. When he left, I watched him walk to his truck and get in. He drives a tan Ford with a little dent on the rear fender. I remember the way the truck coughed and then rolled away, the way his clipboard rested on his knee as if the day would fit in it. I walked back to the cottonwoods slowly, smelling the frost and the faint iron tang of old things turned up in the soil. I crouched at the mound and ran my fingers over the turf like a man touching the edge of a wound. The 24 hours stretched like a season. That night I told Ellen a different lie, that the inspector had called and wanted a look and that I'd be out at the fence for a bit. She looked up from the sink, hands in soapy water, and I could see the worry set in the hollow at her temple. "You been out there long?" she asked. "A spell," I said. "Just checking on with the storm left. I'll be in soon." I wanted to tell her everything. God, how I wanted to tell her everything. But those are the sorts of words that either fix things or ruin them. I had that secret knotted in my throat too tight for a voice. I lay awake that night on the old mattress in our room and thought about what the next day would demand. If Dale came back, what would he find? If he found anything suspect, how would it move from his notebook to the sheriff's hands, then to a county coroner, then to men in suits? How long before someone in a lab coat wrote about it, and someone in a newsroom read the paper and called us? How long before our kids heard our name in a tone they didn't know how to live with? I thought of the creature, if creature is the word for something that had eyes like a thinking thing, and I thought of the way it had looked at me, unblinking. I thought of mercy and meanness and the thin line between them that a man can cross without meaning to. I thought of my father, who when asked if he ever did wrong would say he was a man and inclined to error.
I thought of Ellen's hands, the soft calluses she had from years of setting a table. I thought of the smoothie of mistakes and intentions that had made my life a farmhouse of small, private decisions. The morning came hard and cold. Ellen made coffee without asking me how I slept. The kids were at their own places now, and the farmhouse sighed with a quiet that let small rooms magnify every sound. I went out to the cottonwoods with my shovel because I had to, and because not going felt like a confession in itself. I brushed the sod aside and felt the place where the dirt had been packed a decade ago. The soil was colder deeper down, and when I dug a little, the smell, the faint metallic tang, rose up to the nostrils like something that had been waiting for air. There are things you can't hide forever. The ground remembers. The season where a body sits will wear on it in ways you don't anticipate. Roots curl, the frost heaves, animals smell and leave signs. I had counted on a sort of invisibility to stubbornly hold. I had been wrong. When Dale came back at noon, he carried 2 thermoses and sat on the tailgate of his truck. He looked around the yard like a man that had grown up on maps, knowing how land should read. "Mind if I look?" he asked. I said nothing because I had already decided, in some small, cowardly way, to let him find what he needed to find. The decision had been made in the night when sleep would not come. He got down, knelt, and ran his gloved fingers through the disturbed soil. He frowned in that frugal, practical way and said, "This ought to be checked. We can't just let it stand." "You going to take it in?" I asked, because the truth had to come out one way or another. "Call the sheriff? Call a coroner?" He looked up at me, and for a second there was something like pity in his eyes. "If it's a carcass that somebody's been trying to hide or treat improperly, yeah, it's my job to report. If it's nothing, but I can't leave it as is." That was the turn of the screw. The rest was a weather, small necessary actions. Him opening his notebook, me feeling my hands go clammy. The slow, awful process of something private moving toward public air. I had one last chance, 24 hours. But the momentum of a day moves faster than a man's will. People with uniforms and official stamps are not known for their infinite patience, and I had been living on borrowed time.
I walked away because that's what a person does when they realize a road might take them over a cliff. I went home and sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee that tasted like grit. Ellen asked me, not as a woman confronting a crime, but as someone who had lived beside me all those years, "Are you all right?" I folded my hands around the mug and watched the steam lift in a thin ribbon. "I will be," I said, and the lie settled into the room like dust. I didn't know it then, but this was the first day the secret began to show its teeth. I would stand at many doors after that day, courtrooms and offices, study rooms and cold labs, but the thing that started to unspool the life I had kept together was a man with a clipboard and the stubbornness of duty. If this is the kind of story you want to follow, if you want the rest of it, the way a life unravels when a secret meets a rulebook, then stick around. There's more to it. This is a long country with a lot of fences, and I had a lot of gates to open, whether I wanted to or not. The next hours were a litany of small motions. Dale on the phone with the sheriff, me pacing along the porch, Ellen silent and small in a chair, folding dishcloths as if that could repair the world. I called our son in St. Louis and told him the neighbor had a dead raccoon and that I might need his help mending a fence. He laughed, the way the young do at their father's nonsense, and promised to come out on Sunday if he could. That was all the world I tried to live in, practical arrangements, ordinary lies. But the other world had a way of compressing time. The sheriff's car came at 2:15. Sheriff Tom Wagner is not a man who likes surprises. He's a broad-shouldered man with a laugh that can feel like a gavel. People respect him because he respects the lines he's given. When he leaned on my kitchen counter and asked me to tell me about the disturbed ground, I told him the truth, the way a boy tells a story, crooked, hesitant, leaving out everything that makes the story worse. He listened. He asked questions that were full of professional patience. When he said the words that would change the quiet life Ellen and I had been living, "Mr. Bishop, if there's something here that belongs to the state, we have to handle it properly," the thing I had kept underfoot felt like it had gone on a long, slow roll toward the surface. I remember Ellen standing by the sink making a noise that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. I remember Dale's pen scratching in his little book. I remember the sheriff making a call. I remember the sound of the mailbox flag rattling in the wind like a small bell tolling. And I remember the sudden hot, ridiculous wish to go out and cover the mound again,
to tuck the past back into its hole like a baby under a blanket. The past doesn't stay put for the sake of wishes. They asked me nothing of dramatic sighs at the kitchen table.
They were careful, pragmatic, doing what they were taught to do. It was their job to make the move from suspicion to inspection. It was my job to stand and answer or to refuse. But a farmer knows the law can have a way of walking into your life and taking a thing clean away if you don't stand square. Sheriff Wagner put his hand on my shoulder and said slow and steady, "We'll do this right, Jerry, but I need you to be straight with me. How do you tell the man whose hands you have shaken about a thing you buried with your own hands? How do you tell the man who knows the weather and the cattle and the right time for seed that you did something monstrous in a moment of fear?" I opened my mouth to say nothing, and in that hollow between nothing and everything, I saw the shape of the next 10 years like a road bending into fog. They came the next day with careful shoes. It began with Sheriff Wagner asking for a calm, and it ended with men in lab coats and suits who moved like men who had been given instructions and wanted them followed. I stood on the porch and watched as the county coroner, a man named Avery, put on a pair of latex gloves with the reverence of someone stepping into a church. He knelt at the mound and found what the frost and the seasons had taken and left. He worked slow, with tools meant not to harm but to expose. A trowel, a brush, a little metal probe like something you'd use to clean the creases on a saddle. He cleared away the topsoil and the leaves I had laid down a decade earlier. The smell was there, faint, not the violent rot you read about in novels, but the dry, organic staleness of a thing that had lain under dirt for years. I tried not to breathe too deeply. What we found was not whole. It was enough. Bones, hair clinging in patches to the pelvis and the longer limb segments, fragments of skull. Some parts had biodegraded into a soft earthen powder, while others held their shape as if stubbornly refusing to dissolve. There were teeth, worn in a way that told you a story nobody wanted to tell, gnawing on roots, chewing fibrous plants, maybe tearing at meat if it found meat. The hands, or what remained of them, showed long metacarpals and phalanges slender and curved in a way my life had not prepared me to understand. I stood with my hat in my hand while photographs were taken, each click of the camera like a small hammer on my chest. They labeled bags with numbers, they numbered photographs, they wrote chain of custody forms with soft, deliberate handwriting. Every signature tightened the rope a little. Sheriff Wagner asked me to tell the story I had to tell, in the simplest, leached form of plain fact. I told him I had shot an animal in 1968, that I had buried it, and that I wanted to do whatever it took to make right where I had gone wrong.
The coroner looked at me with a face that was all duct tape and procedure. He offered no comfort, only a clipboard and the weight of what had to be done. Then a man in a pressed suit introduced himself as Agent Catherine Morrison from the federal office. She had a voice like a courthouse, efficient without malice. She showed credentials and spoke of jurisdiction. The moment she said potentially significant specimen, the room in my head emptied out and left a single buzzing bird of anxiety to carry the rest. When she asked if she could have custody of the remains for further analysis, I found myself nodding like a man on a trader ship, because what else do you do when authority has a net ready to take what you tried to hide? "They'll take it to a federal lab," Sheriff Wagner explained. "Proper facilities, chain of custody. You'll get a statement to sign." I signed more statements than I ever signed deeds on the land. Each signature was another gentle theft of the story I had lived with. Dr. Martin Fletcher arrived before the specimen left the county. He was not in a suit. He had a rumpled sweater and wire frames, and a hand that shook ever so slightly when he reached out to touch a box. He introduced himself as a biologist at the State University, with a specialty in mammalian anatomy, and a reputation for not calling things sensational just because someone else was. He knelt and looked at that patched hair and said softly, "This is worth everything we can give it." He listened to me the way a man listens when he thinks the story might change his field. He asked me about dates, about the weapon, about things that only a scientist thinks to ask, the angle of the shot, the distance, the last time I saw the animal move. I told him what I could remember, and Dr. Fletcher took notes as if making a catalog of apology. He did not say the words that he might have wanted to say, that this could be the most important anatomical specimen he'd seen in 30 years. He kept his hope measured, professional. Even his excitement was careful. By mid-afternoon, the federal vehicle was backing down the lane. 2 men in plain clothing loaded crates into the back with gloved hands, careful not to let anything touch anything else that could contaminate it. Agent Morrison gave me a card and told me not to leave town. She was by the book and spoke a sentence that would stay with me. We are taking material for analysis. Until it's processed, everything about it is provisional. We can't make claims until we can verify. There was a kind of quiet after they left, the kind that comes after storms and funerals. Ellen sat on the back steps with her apron still on, the day's dishes cold in the sink. She folded her hands in her lap like someone who has been given a small, sharp pebble to hold and has to decide what to do with it. She looked at me, and the years stacked up in her face like a topography of patience and hurt. "What happens now?" she asked.
"I don't know," I said, which was the truest thing I had spoken for that week. The sheriff took my statement. The county had to file a report. The papers were called. A reporter named Sarah Jennings from the state capitol got the first call and asked to come out for a look. She arrived with a tape recorder and the easy hunger of someone whose job was to turn complexity into a column. News traveled like grease on a skillet. By the time the crates left my property, there were whispers in the diner, and a stranger asking the postmaster to point out my lane. The kids, my sons, called from wherever they were and asked blunt questions about the legalities. I told them in pieces, like passing keys across a fence. They were angry at first, then quiet. My neighbor came over, half sympathy and half curiosity, to look at my hands, as if trying to read a ledger of sin. The federal lab did what labs are supposed to do. It processed, measured, took apart, and held things up under microscopes. It documented. A copy of the report, what would later be called the leaked summary, was produced as part of the custody chain, and for a time classified. They called it an unidentified hominid specimen in internal memos. They ran pieces of material for cellular analysis. Dr. Fletcher begged for a look at the slides, tried to influence the chain of custody with polite letters and formal requests, and was, more than once, politely refused. Legal counsel reached out to me through a friend, Rebecca Hartman. She walked into my house with a legal pad and a direct gaze. Rebecca had the kind of voice that pulled at the threads of a fact until it told the truth, not the story someone hoped it would. She was younger than me and fierce in a way that made me feel guilty for being feeble. She explained what I was facing: state charges for unlawful disposal, potential violations of wildlife statutes, the possibility of federal interest because of jurisdictional law around protected species and evidence. She told me in a way that made it simple and yet heavy. You did a wrong thing. There are legal ways to deal with wrong things. We will try to get you the lightest legal consequences and the most honest public outcome. The first court hearing was in the small county courthouse downtown. The courtroom smelled like wood and years, like people who have had to sit through many small tragedies. Rebecca counseled me to be straightforward. The prosecution, a county attorney with a narrow jaw, laid out the case in methodical terms. A body was discovered. It had been concealed. Chain of custody concerns now complicated the scientific value. The federal agents were present in the gallery, their faces unreadable. Dr. Fletcher sat quietly in the front row with a legal pad and a look that said he would be willing to testify to whatever he had seen or known. I saw Agent Morrison behind him, a hand folded across her knee, the shape of duty in profile.
We argued about intent, something lawyers love and which juries hate. My defense centered on fear, on a man's instinct to protect family and property, and the creature itself from exploitation. The prosecution centered on rule of law and public interest. Rebecca negotiated like a farmer, bartering for seed at the end of the year. She took what she could and gave up what she must. She argued for a plea that would acknowledge guilt but leave room for mercy, a misdemeanant clause, community service related to wildlife education, a fine commensurate with the county's scale. The prosecution wanted a sterner rebuke, given that the specimen's potential scientific significance made concealment weightier. Judge Harris was a practical man. He listened to our arguments with the slow patience of a man used to balancing ledgers. He asked me to stand and say what I had done and why. My voice cracked in the middle. I told the story, again, this time with the addition of an older man's understanding of wrong. The courtroom was full of neighbors, a couple of television cameras from the city, and citizens whose faces I recognized from the church. Ellen sat in the gallery with her hands clasped, and the motion of her fingers looked like prayer. In the end, the court took the plea deal. I admitted to unlawful disposal and failing to report an incident involving wildlife. I was fined, assigned community service hours for county conservation programs, and put on probation. The judge ordered me to speak at a local community forum about wildlife safety as part of my service, which Rebecca saw as an odd mercy, forced confession as a path to restitution. Importantly, the judge refused to sign an order that would forever gag me from speaking about the facts of the case. He said the government could not legally impose an absolute indefinite silence on a citizen. Any restrictions would have to be narrowly tailored.
That nuance would later matter. The specimen in the meantime had been folded into federal custody and classified as sensitive pending analysis. The label meant little to me on a day-to-day basis until it meant everything when outsiders began knocking. There were offers which I refused in the way a man refuses poison, journalists offering cash for an exclusive, collectors hinting at generous sums. I refused them because the thing that outraged me most was the thought of the creature being reduced to a curiosity show. But I also refused because I felt guilty and didn't want to profit from the shame that had crippled me. It was months, long, cold months, before anything more concrete leaked. I tried to live in the interval. Ellen and I rebuilt small parts of our intimacy by returning to small rituals. We would go to the diner on Saturday mornings and sit in the corner booth, where the radio played country ballads and the coffee was thick and cheap. We spoke, haltingly, of gardens and of our children. She forgave in increments.
Her forgiveness wasn't a sudden wash. It was a pace of returning to the table. Sometimes she would say, "You should have told me," and I would answer, "I should have." That exchange, one line and a mirror of it back, was the work that saved us. Then the leak came, not from a single source, but like a hairline crack letting out a grunt of steam. An anonymous package, an encrypted email, and then a photocopy of an internal summary that leafed its way into the public domain. It was labeled Preliminary Morphological and Genetic Findings, and it had a cautious tone. Experiments described as inconclusive in places, anomalous sequences in others, careful hedging in the voice of scientists who did their work by uncertainty. It suggested, without declaring, that the mitochondrial sequences did not neatly match known North American fauna, and that nuclear DNA showed divergence from typical primate baselines in some markers. The summary used words like potentially significant and further study warranted, which is the scientist's version of lighting a fuse. The world responded the way the world does when given the smallest ember. The flame crawled up. Newspapers splashed headlines. Television programs debated us like a new kind of weather system. Talk shows called my house, and Ellen answered once, explaining she was tired and wanted to be left alone. The host mocked her exhaustion for ratings. The leak brought with it an ugly surge of sensation, the people who wanted to believe, and those who wanted to tear into anything that felt like mystery. There were op-eds, frame-by-frame analyses by folks who turned my backyard into a stage. Scientists were caught between curiosity and caution. Some of them, like Dr. Fletcher, argued for open study, for peer-reviewed access and transparency. Others urged restraint and strict containment, warning about contamination and misinterpretation. Agent Morrison remained a steady presence in the background. She did not speak to the press. Her office issued terse statements about a specimen in federal custody, classified for the moment due to national interest. They invoked words like chain of custody and biological safety and ongoing investigation. To some ears, that sounded like cover-up, to others like protection, a way to keep something fragile from being mishandled by amateurs or plundered by profiteers. I could see both sides. It felt like standing in the middle of a field with wind from two directions. The leak had consequences for me beyond the courtroom. People who once treated me with polite curiosity began to see me as a public figure of a sort, an emblem of danger and secrecy, and for some, of bravery. My letters filled with hate and with hope. One man wrote to say my heart was evil. Another sent a photo asking if a friend of a friend could get a piece of the specimen for study.
I burned a few letters in the wood stove and saved the rest in a shoebox. I could not bear to throw away the things, even when they were cruel to me. Rebecca counseled caution. "This is bigger than you," she said one evening, folding the legal arguments in her hands like a roadmap. "You are right now a node in a public debate. The safest legal route is to cooperate, to be transparent, but to insist on protections for everything that could be misused: your family, the specimen's integrity, the science." We argued about whether to lobby publicly for release of the full data. Dr. Fletcher urged it. Agent Morrison did not, insists that some of the data, if mishandled, could compromise the integrity of the subsequent investigation. There were legal limits around classified materials. There were also moral questions about who gets to hold knowledge and why. I found myself in a position where I had to pick a side: secrecy as protection or exposure as justice. The leak complicated that. It forced the conversation into hard light and charged every step with accusation and possibility. The case that would become a public litmus test for how we treat unknown biological finds moved to a higher stage. There were hearings where the question of classification versus transparency was debated. Dr. Fletcher testified in favor of controlled release. Let scientists with proper credentials examine the material,
publish their findings, and subject them to peer review. He spoke softly about the scientific method and loudly about ethics. He said the knowledge belonged to the common stock of humanity, though he recognized that protection against exploitation was a legitimate concern. Opposing him from the federal side were men who spoke of national interest in the abstract. They did not call it a threat. They used the language of asset management and data integrity. Their testimony was measured, almost clinical. I watched them from the gallery and felt some small, private outrage creep up my spine, an anger at the idea that knowledge could be locked away behind stamps and seals while people argued over who had dibs on truth. When the subject of my motive came up in public forums, I didn't find much solace in rhetoric. At one hearing, Representative Collins asked me on camera why I had buried the body. The man had a hand on my elbow like he wanted to lead me somewhere noble. I said it plainly: fear and shame, and the ugly, stubborn, selfish notion that by hiding it, I could keep the harm away from those I loved. I said I was wrong. People listened. Some nodded with forgiveness in their faces. Others spat accusations. That was the bargain of public admission. It cleared the air in one part of life and made you pay for it in another. Then the anonymous leaker came forward, in a way that was as anonymous as such things can be. A scanned copy of a Fuller report landed on a journalist's desk with a note that said, "We can't be the only ones who know."
The report was still hedged, full of qualifiers, but it allowed the scientific community to peer at the data. A few labs replicated tests on the fragments that Dr. Fletcher and others were allowed to see. Some found anomalies, others found artifacts they called contamination. The debate moved from, is there something out there, to what exactly is this data telling us? The complexity of genetic analysis, mitochondrial quirks, nuclear markers, was suddenly in backyard conversations on porches and in heated letters to the paper. What a leak did, above all, was force the federal office to loosen the screws a tad. Public pressure is a blunt instrument, but it works on certain mechanisms: oversight hearings in Washington, calls from advocacy groups for transparency, and senators with agendas looking for press. Agent Morrison, who was never quick to grandstand, found herself answering in a more open register. The offices began to permit controlled access to certain researchers under strict supervision for independent verification. Dr. Fletcher got on a list. He was allowed to observe under tight rules and to publish parts of his observations, framed carefully. The scientists, shy, meticulous men and women, took their work like priests taking scripture. They published papers with footnotes and cautionary tales, with images of bone fragments and charts of base pair alignments. The conclusions were cautious. Anomalies suggested that the specimen didn't snugly fit into the categories for known fauna, but the dataset was small, and some sequences could be explained by contamination, mutation, or simply the wild buffet of genetic variability. Headlines wanted certainties the reports wouldn't give them. A few journals published speculative pieces, and others refused anything less than replicable results. The public shuffled between wonder and skepticism. There was a moment when the conversation turned personal again. A rival journalist dug into my past and found embarrassing letters and petty debts and turned them into a case for moral unfitness, the kind of reductionism that belated certain talk shows. Ellen read the pieces and pressed her hand to her chest and said, "They don't know how you smell in the morning." She meant the rough, human smell of a man who has done the work of living. She and I fought in the kitchen once, bitterly, with the old sharpness that comes when a couple has to decide whether love is enough to cover every human failing. We made up by the same slow process of returning to the table. Rebecca, during all this, kept me out of the worst legal traps. She argued for a mitigation that acknowledged the moral weight of my actions without making me a public martyr. She argued the law with an eye toward the human story. There had been no attempt to profit, no sale, no trafficking. The issue of scientific discovery was not to be equated with a smuggling ring. The result was not as clean as heroism or villainy.
I took a plea that included a period of supervised community service, educational work with local youth about wildlife safety, and about the obligations of landowners when encountering unusual findings. It felt, in a small way, like being given a chance to teach what I'd learned the hard way. My public statements shifted over time. At first, I refused interviews because I was raw, ashamed, and worried about legal limits. Later, with counsel, I spoke at community meetings and spoke plainly on local radio about how fear can make a man do wrong and how secrecy corrodes what it touches. I insisted that any scientific study be done in the open as much as safety allowed. I pressed, quietly and without many cameras, for independent peer review. I wrote letters to lawmakers asking for clearer statutes on how to handle unusual biological finds. guidelines that would not criminalize a scared landowner, but would protect scientific inquiry and prevent looting. Those letters got folded into hearings. They moved things by a fraction. The leak did one other thing. It fractured the binary of belief and disbelief in my community. There were people who had been sure I was a liar, and others who had always thought the woods held things no one would admit. The leak made it possible for neither side to fully claim the field. It introduced a gray that is unpleasant to the human eye, complexity. I liked that, in small part, because it fit the truth. There was no neat ending to this story. As years passed, the public interest cooled and moved to other things: wars, elections, a new scandal. The specimen stayed in federal custody, carefully cataloged. Some parts were returned for local archival use, others remained in classified storage. Dr. Fletcher's career bruised and brightened. He published cautious papers that opened new questions about biodiversity and about the ways we classify life. He compared the specimen's anomalies to the island species of long ago, variations that make taxonomies creak. He wrote with humility and asked for more samples, which the federal office found it impossible to supply because there were none. The idea that a single specimen could rewrite a field is the stuff of novels. In truth, scientific revolutions take time, funding, and a stack of specimens. One crate in a federal lab can prompt fascination, but it can't build a consensus. My own life moved in small increments. The fine I paid hurt. The probation made some mornings feel like wearing a hair shirt. The community service was oddly a balm. I taught kids about fences and safety and what to do when they found tracks they couldn't explain. Call authorities, don't interfere, write down details. I used my shame as a cautionary tale, and the kids listened with the rapt attention that children give to grown men with large mistakes. It pulled me back into an ordinary usefulness I had been missing for years. Ellen and I found a way to sit together without the largest silence between us.
It never felt like full payment. Repayment is a foolish word for things that can't be made right. People asked me now and then if I regretted the discovery itself. My answer was always the same. I regretted the moment my hand moved. If the world had shown me a thing I did not understand without me killing it, perhaps the story would be different. But we do not get to choose the exact course of a single reflex. We get to choose what to do afterward. That's why the years after 1968 matter more to me than the initial encounter. They contain the labor of living with what you have done. There is a more subtle truth I have learned. Secrecy devours the life around it. The hidden thing grows tentacles into every small decision. The tiny lies we tell to preserve secrecy are the mortar that builds a slow prison. Ellen would not let me forget this. "You buried more than a body," she'd say sometimes, quiet and sharp. "You buried a part of us." She was right. The reconciliation we made was not a magic spell. It was a daily recommitment to speak plainly and to let the world intersect our private one without hiding every uncomfortable edge. I do not know if others of its kind walk these hills. I do not know if the specimen in that crate would prove the existence of a population. The scientists were cautious, the data messy, the classifications slippery. That uncertainty, though, is its own kind of mercy. It gives us room to behave ethically. If you cannot be sure of the stakes, then you must be a little more careful in the ways you act. What happened next after I buried that animal in 1968 is a long, messy trail of consequences. A decade of carrying the secret, discovery by a man who loved his job, the slow gears of law and science grinding toward contact, the federal seizure and a leak that forced partial transparency, courtroom confession and punishment, and then years of small restitution that rebuilt a life in a different shape. There was no neat justice, no cinematic vindication. There was a compromise, and there were grudges and forgiveness sewn into the fabric of the farmhouse. There was finally a little more daylight on how we might handle the unknown together. I sometimes go down to the north field at dusk, to where the mound used to be, and I walk the edge of it with my hands behind my back. The grass grows there now, as it always did. A line of lilacs I planted with Ellen has grown into a hedge and sends up a fragrance in June that makes me think of small salvations. I kneel sometimes and press my hand into the soil and feel the cold and the grit. I tell the ground the truth, that I did wrong, that I have tried to make amends, and that I will spend the rest of my days trying not to put my head in the sand again. There is no tidy moral in what happened. There is only the slow, human ledger of actions and consequences.
If you want to understand this story as an archive of choices, fear made me violent, secrecy made me smaller, confession let me start to be useful again. If you want to know whether I would do it differently, kill instead of hide or hide instead of call, my answer is simple and shamed. I would have called. I would have taken my medicine. I would have let other people be the ones to handle the unknown. The burden of secrecy has a geometry all its own. It turns small lies into mountains. You asked what happened next. The short answer is the world found out, slowly and painfully. The longer answer is it reshaped my life and sparked a conversation that, in the best way, made some changes in policy and how scientists and landowners communicate, and in how my neighbors and I think about responsibility. The leak forced the government to be less hermetic. The scientists were angrier and humbler and more deliberate. My marriage, after all the ugly work, endured in a way that made me grateful and small. If you want to look through the documents and see the cautious language, the chain of custody logs, the copies of those early analyses that slipped into public view, you'll find them referenced alongside interviews and court transcripts. Read them and you'll see the same thing I did. People trying to figure out how to handle something they were never taught to handle. There's no villain in this story you'd want to demonize, except perhaps the cowardice in me that made me hide the truth. At night, I still sometimes dream the shape of that animal stepping into the light. In the dreams, it never looks monstrous. It looks like a wronged creature asking for a different kind of courtesy than the world had given it. I wake up and put my boots on and go out to the porch and look out over the field and think about stewardship and what we owe the planet and each other. The question is not about proof or fame. It's about moral imagination. Can we imagine being kin enough to treat unknown life with a mixture of curiosity and reverence? And can we imagine a system that lets frightened men make the right call without fearing ruin? If you're thinking this is a neat lesson, it's not. I'm an old man with dirt under his nails and the memory of a trigger in his hand. But I've tried, in the years since 1968, to turn my mistake into a series of small goods, speaking to kids about responsibility, writing to lawmakers, resisting the urge to make money off a thing that killed my conscience. It's not much. It is what I have. For those who want to follow the paper trail, court records, public statements, and copies of the analyses that surfaced in the leak, you'll find links and sources in the description. If this story reached you and made you ask questions about how we treat the unknown, consider subscribing for more accounts like this and share it with someone who will listen.
I buried a thing once, and it buried me for a while. Telling it true has been the only way I've found to unearth the rest of myself.